My name is Adrienne Hayes, and I'm 31 years old. 6 months ago, at my twin sister's $400,000 wedding at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan, I was seated at table 28, the table reserved for the catering staff. My mother told the photographer to crop me out of the family photos because, and I quote, "We don't need the help in the pictures." The help? I'm not the help. I'm a chef. I own my own restaurant. But to her, working with my hands made me invisible, made me less than, made me the embarrassment she had to hide. While my twin sister, Evelyn Hayes, 10 minutes younger than me, same DNA, same face, stood across the ballroom in a Vera Wang gown, accepting congratulations for making something of herself. Then a man in a Tom Ford suit sat down beside me at table 28. He looked directly at me and said, "You're Adrienne Hayes. I know exactly who you are." Then he smiled slightly and added, "And I think it's time everyone else did too." When he stood up to give a toast, my sister's smile froze. My mother went pale, because some secrets can't stay buried, and some people can't stay invisible forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start 6 months before the wedding, the moment everything began to fall apart. The night everything began was a Tuesday in December. It was 11:23 p.m., and I was standing alone in the kitchen of my restaurant, Luce di Mare, a small 26-seat Italian place tucked into a quiet street in Brooklyn, New York. Most restaurants in Manhattan were still loud and buzzing at that hour. Mine wasn't. Luce di Mare had the kind of atmosphere where the lights were soft. The tables were close together, and the regulars knew your name before you even introduced yourself. The kind of place where strangers shared wine with people they had just met and ended up talking until midnight. But tonight, the dining room was dark. Service had ended hours ago. The only sounds in the kitchen were the low hum of the walk-in refrigerator and the faint scrape of my knife against the cutting board. I had been there since 4 a.m, 16 hours. My hands were dusted with semolina flour as I rolled fresh pasta dough across the stainless steel counter. Tagliatelle. Hand-cut, every strand exactly 3 millimeters wide. Across the stove, a pot of stock simmered slowly, releasing the rich smell of roasted bones, herbs, and garlic into the quiet kitchen. Cooking had always been like meditation to me. Everything outside the kitchen faded away. Deadlines, expectations, people, especially my family, which was why I almost ignored the call when my phone lit up on the counter. "Mom," I stared at the screen for 3 rings. My mother rarely called. Not on birthdays, not on holidays, not even when my restaurant opened 3 years ago. The last time we had spoken was Thanksgiving, 8 months earlier. She had hosted dinner for 30 guests at her townhouse on the Upper East Side and somehow managed to introduce my sister Evelyn to everyone without mentioning that she had another daughter. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered, "Adrienne." No hello, no greeting, just my name, spoken the way someone checks off an item on a list. "Evelyn is engaged." I blinked. "That's great," I said carefully. "Who's the lucky guy?" "Christopher Whitmore IV, corporate attorney at Harrington and Pike. Excellent family." Her voice carried the faint clink of crystal glasses in the background. She was probably at some dinner party, or charity event, or country club gathering where everyone pretended their lives were perfect. "The wedding will be in June," she continued, "at the Waldorf Astoria, around 350 guests." 350? My hand tightened around the phone. "That's big. It will be an important event," she replied coolly. "The Whitmores have a reputation to maintain." Of course they did. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause my mother used when she was deciding how to phrase something unpleasant. "We're finalizing vendors," she said, "and I was thinking, your restaurant," there it was, the real reason she had called. "Could you help with the catering? Not would you like to attend? Not your sister wants you there. Help!" I leaned back against the counter and stared at the ceiling. "Mom," I said slowly, "catering a wedding for 350 people isn't exactly helping. Professional catering for that size event cost between $45,000 and $60,000. It required trucks, staff, prep kitchens, weeks of planning. You wouldn't have to do everything," she said quickly. "Just assist the main team." Assistant, meaning work for free. "This is your sister's wedding, Adrienne." The familiar chill crept into her voice. "Surely you can make an exception for family." Family, that word again. The one she only used when she needed something. I rubbed flour between my fingers and looked around my kitchen. The copper pans, the wooden shelves lined with olive oil from Tuscany, the menu board where I rewrote dishes every morning. Everything in this room existed because I had built it from nothing. I can't provide $50,000 of free labor, I said quietly. I have a business, employees, rent. Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then she spoke again, colder than before. I see. Well, if that's how you feel, she said sharply, perhaps it's best you don't come at all. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. For a long moment, I just stood there in the empty kitchen, surrounded by the smell of simmering broth and fresh pasta. The familiar weight settled in my chest. Not surprise. Not even anger. Just the old quiet understanding that I had always been the disappointing daughter. Across the kitchen, the door opened. A tall man with silver hair stepped inside carrying a bag of groceries. Marco Bellini, my business partner, and the closest thing I had to family. He stopped when he saw my face. What happened? He asked. My sister's getting married. Marco set the groceries on the counter and studied me carefully. And that makes you look like someone died. I gave a small laugh. My mother asked if I'd cater the wedding for free. Of course she did, he said calmly. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Are you going? I stared at the pot of stock simmering on the stove. Steam curled slowly toward the ceiling. I don't know. Marco folded his arms. You should decide something important first. What? He tilted his head slightly. Whether you're going as a daughter or as staff. I didn't answer, but deep down I already knew. And somehow I had the strange feeling that this wedding was going to change everything. Sometimes the most unbelievable stories start quietly like this. If you enjoy stories where the truth slowly unfolds, stay with me, because what happened at that wedding still surprises people who hear it. The text started 15 minutes after my mother hung up. I had just turned off the stove and begun cleaning the kitchen when my phone buzzed again. Evelyn. My twin sister rarely contacted me either, so seeing her name on the screen immediately felt strange. The first message was simple. Hey Adri, Mom said you two talked. I hope everything's okay. I stared at it for a moment before setting the phone down and continuing to wipe the counter. 2 minutes later, another message appeared. I know things have been weird between us lately, but you're still my sister. I really want you at the wedding. Then another. Please come. It wouldn't feel right without you there. 3 texts in less than 10 minutes. Carefully written, carefully polite, carefully avoiding the one thing that actually mattered. Not once did she mention that our mother had just suggested uninviting me because I refused to provide $50,000 of free catering. Not once did she ask how I was doing. Not once did she mention my restaurant. Instead, every sentence revolved around her wedding, her day, her happiness. I leaned against the counter and read the messages again. Evelyn Hayes, my twin, 10 minutes younger than me, same dark hair, same eyes, same face. For the first 18 years of our lives, people had trouble telling us apart. Teachers confused our names. Friends joked that we were mirrors of each other. Growing up, we did everything together. Same classes, same school activities, same college plans. We had both been accepted into Columbia University with pre-law tracks. Our mother loved telling people that story. My daughters are going to be lawyers, she would say proudly at dinner parties. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The summer after our sophomore year of college, I had taken a trip to Italy, Bologna first, then Florence. It was supposed to be a 3-week vacation. Instead, I spent most of the time working in tiny restaurant kitchens for room and board. I learned to make pasta from women who had been doing it for 50 years. I learned how to cook slowly, carefully, patiently. And somewhere between rolling dough at 6 in the morning and serving plates of handmade ravioli to strangers at night, I realized something that terrified me. I didn't want to become a lawyer. I wanted to cook. When I told my mother, she cried. Not because she would miss me, because she was embarrassed. Do you know what people will think? She had said. That I raised a daughter who cooks for a living. Evelyn stayed on the path. Law school, corporate firm, partner track. Everything our mother had always wanted. Meanwhile, I dropped out of pre-law and enrolled in culinary school. That was the moment the distance between us began. Slowly at first, then completely. Now Evelyn worked 80 hours a week at Harrington and Pike, one of the most prestigious law firms in New York. She wore designer suits and attended charity galas. My days started at 4 in the morning, covered in flour and olive oil. For years, our mother had introduced Evelyn as if she were an only child. And tonight, suddenly, she wanted me at the wedding. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Mom says you might not come. Please don't let a misunderstanding ruin this. A misunderstanding. I almost laughed. Across the kitchen, Marco was unpacking groceries into the fridge. He glanced over his shoulder. You're smiling like someone who just read something ridiculous. My sister wants me at the wedding. And your mother? Suggested I stay home if I won't cater. Marco nodded slowly. That sounds like your family. He closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. So what will you do? I looked down at the phone again. The truth was simple. Part of me wanted to ignore the messages. Stay in Brooklyn. Focus on the restaurant. Forget the wedding even existed. But another part of me, an older, quieter part, knew I would go anyway. Not because I expected anything to change. Not because I believed my family would suddenly treat me differently, but because sometimes you need to look at a situation one last time before walking away from it forever. I picked up the phone and typed a reply. Congratulations on your engagement, Evelyn. I'll be there. 23 words. Short. Professional. No warmth. No promises. Just confirmation. I hit send. Marco watched me carefully. Well, he asked. I'm going. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. Adrienne. What? You already know how this will go. I did. I knew exactly how it would go. But there are moments in life when you need to see something with your own eyes. 3 days later, the formal invitation arrived. Heavy cream cardstock, gold embossing, elegant calligraphy. The kind of invitation that costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. At the top it read, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Whitmore request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, Christopher Whitmore IV, to Miss Evelyn Hayes. Near the bottom, in smaller lettering, was my name, Adrienne Hayes plus guest. Not sister of the bride, not family, just another guest among 350. I pinned the invitation to the refrigerator door with a magnet. Marco studied it for a moment. Do you want to know something? He said. What? In Italy, weddings are about family. I folded my arms. And here? He gave a small shrug. Sometimes they're about something else. I looked at the invitation again. The gold lettering caught the kitchen light. Beautiful. Expensive. Cold. For a moment, a strange thought crossed my mind. I wondered where I would be sitting. I had no idea that 6 months later, it would be table 28. The invitation stayed on my refrigerator for 3 weeks. I didn't look at it often, but every time I opened the fridge for milk or vegetables, the gold lettering caught the light and reminded me that the wedding was getting closer. June in New York arrived quickly. Restaurants get busier when the weather warms up. People want open windows, fresh pasta, wine on the sidewalk. For me, the weeks before the wedding became a blur of 14-hour days. Prep at dawn, lunch service, dinner service, then cleaning, ordering ingredients, planning the next menu. Work had always been my way of keeping things simple. In the kitchen, the rules were clear. If the food was good, people were happy. Outside the kitchen, things were never that simple. One evening after service, Marco noticed me staring at the calendar above the prep station. You're thinking about the wedding again, he said. I need a dress. He raised one eyebrow. That's what worries you? It's a black tie wedding at the Waldorf Astoria, I said. I can't show up wearing kitchen shoes. Marco chuckled. You're overthinking it. Maybe I was. But there are certain events where appearances matter, even when you wish they didn't. 2 days later, I took the afternoon off and walked through Park Slope, Brooklyn. There was a small consignment boutique on a quiet street that sold designer clothes at discount prices. I had passed it dozens of times but had never gone inside. A little bell chimed when I pushed the door open. The store smelled faintly of perfume and cedarwood. Racks of dresses lined the walls, silk, satin, velvet, colors that shifted under the soft lights. A woman behind the counter looked up from a magazine. Looking for something special? Black tie, I said. Wedding? I nodded. She studied me for a moment, then walked toward one of the racks. What's your budget? $200. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't comment. After a few minutes of searching, she pulled out a dress. Emerald green silk. Simple. Elegant. The tag said it was vintage, probably from the 1990s. Try this. The dressing room mirror was tall and unforgiving. For a moment, I just stood there holding the dress in my hands. Then I slipped it on. It fit perfectly. Not tight, not flashy, the kind of dress that didn't try too hard. When I stepped out, the woman behind the counter smiled. That's the one. How much? $200 exactly. I ran my fingers across the silk. $200 was more than I usually spent on clothes, but the dress looked right. All right, I said. As she wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, she asked casually, "So whose wedding is it?" "My sister's." "Close family?" I hesitated. "Yes," I said finally. Technically, that was true. When I returned to the restaurant, Marco looked up from the stove. "You bought it?" I held up the garment bag. "Let's see." I rolled my eyes. "Absolutely not." But 10 minutes later, he had convinced me to try it on in the small office at the back of the restaurant. When I stepped out, he leaned against the desk and nodded slowly. "You clean up well, chef." "Very funny." "No, I'm serious," he said. Then his expression softened slightly. "You and your sister really do look identical." I knew that. Evelyn and I shared the same dark hair, the same eyes, the same bone structure people described as striking. But that was where the similarities ended. She would be wearing Vera Wang, custom fitted, probably worth more than my car. Meanwhile, I had a secondhand dress that cost $200. Same face, different worlds. The week before the wedding, I worked harder than usual. Part of it was practical. I needed the restaurant to run smoothly while I was gone. Part of it was something else, a quiet tension sitting just beneath the surface. By Thursday night, I had written 8 pages of instructions for the staff, sauce recipes, prep schedules, wine pairings. Marco watched me writing and shook his head. "You're preparing like you're leaving for a month." "It's only 2 days," I said. "Then relax." I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know what I was walking into. The night before I left for Manhattan, Marco drove me to Penn Station. His car smelled faintly of garlic and espresso, 2 things that seemed permanently attached to him. He helped me lift my suitcase from the trunk. "You remember something," he said. "What?" "You are not what your mother thinks you are." I smiled faintly. "I know. You are a chef." "I know. You create something from nothing," he continued. "That is power." The train announcement echoed through the station. Passengers began boarding. I hugged him quickly. "Take care of the restaurant." He waved me off. "Go survive the wedding." As the train pulled away from the platform and the lights of Brooklyn slid past the window, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Not fear exactly, something quieter, like standing at the edge of a moment you know will change things, even if you don't know how yet. I leaned my head against the window and watched the city blur past. At that moment, I still believed the hardest part of the weekend would be facing my family. I didn't yet know that the real surprise was waiting for me inside the Waldorf Astoria, and that before the night was over, someone would look at me and say the words that would change everything. "You're Adrienne Hayes. I know exactly who you are." The Waldorf Astoria rose above Park Avenue like a monument to old money. Tall stone walls, polished brass doors, a row of black cars waiting outside the entrance like something from a movie. When my taxi pulled up that Friday afternoon, I sat still for a moment before stepping out. Manhattan had always felt different from Brooklyn. Sharper, more polished, more expensive. A bellman in a dark uniform opened the door for me. "Welcome to the Waldorf Astoria, ma'am." I thanked him and pulled my suitcase onto the sidewalk. Inside, the lobby looked exactly the way magazines described it. Marble floors that reflected the chandeliers above. Gold accents on every railing and doorway. Fresh white flowers arranged in towering vases. The kind of place where everything whispered wealth without ever needing to say it out loud. The bellman glanced at his clipboard. "Are you here for the Whitmore Hayes wedding?" "Yes," I said. "Wonderful. Are you checking in with the family suite?" "I believe so," I replied. At least that was what I had assumed. The bellman scanned the list again. Then he frowned slightly. "Just a moment, please." He walked over to the concierge desk and spoke quietly with another employee. A few seconds later, he returned. "I'm sorry for the confusion, ma'am," he said politely, "but I don't see your name under the family accommodations." My stomach tightened. "That's strange. I'm the bride's sister." He hesitated. "Oh, I see." He looked down at the list again. There are several vendor arrivals today, he said carefully. If you're part of the catering or event staff, check-in is through the service entrance on 49th Street. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I'm not staff, I said slowly. I'm Adrienne Hayes, the bride's twin sister. The bellman looked uncomfortable. Of course, ma'am. If you have your own reservation, you can check in at the main desk. My own reservation. Of course. I wheeled my suitcase across the marble floor toward the reception counter. A few minutes later, I had my answer. No room had been reserved for me. The family suite, 4 bedrooms and a private terrace, had been booked for my mother, Evelyn, and the bridesmaids, but not me. I stood there holding the key card to a single room on the 8th floor. $425 a night. 3 nights. $1,275. I paid it without arguing. Some battles aren't worth having in hotel lobbies. The elevator ride up felt strangely quiet. When the doors opened, I walked down the hallway until I found my room. It was beautiful in the way all luxury hotel rooms are beautiful. Large bed, soft lighting, perfectly folded towels in the bathroom. But it wasn't the family suite, and we both knew it. After dropping my suitcase beside the bed, I stood there for a moment staring at the ceiling. Then I laughed quietly to myself. Of course my mother hadn't booked a room for me. Why would she? 20 minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. The rehearsal dinner wasn't until 7. I still had hours to kill. So I took the elevator back down to the lobby and wandered toward the ballroom level. Staff members moved quickly through the hallways, carrying trays of glasses and boxes of decorations. At the entrance to the grand ballroom, 2 large easels held the seating charts for the rehearsal dinner. Cream-colored cards, elegant black calligraphy, white roses arranged around the frames. I walked closer. Table 1 through 8. Immediate family, senior partners from Christopher's law firm. Close relatives. Table 9 through 15. College friends. Law school colleagues. Table 16 through 22. Extended family. Table 23 through 27. Professional contacts. Then I found my name. Table 28. I looked at the other names listed beside it. Robert Chen, Sarah Martinez, David Walsh, Jennifer Lee, Marcus Anderson. For a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then it clicked. Robert Chen was the photographer. Sarah Martinez was the florist. David Walsh managed the band. Jennifer Lee was the event coordinator. Marcus Anderson supervised catering, the vendor table. My mother had placed me with the staff, not with extended family. Not with friends, not even with distant relatives, with the people hired to work the wedding. I stared at the card for a long moment. Then I stepped back. Across the hallway, a group of guests walked past laughing, dressed in expensive suits and dresses. None of them noticed me standing there. A few minutes later, I returned to my room. My phone buzzed the moment I sat down on the bed. An email from the wedding planner. Subject, vendor coordination, table 28. I opened it slowly. Dear Miss Hayes, as you are seated at the vendor coordination table, please note the following guidelines. Vendor dress code is business formal. Please enter through the service entrance on 49th Street. Vendor meals will be served after guest service is complete. I read the email twice, then 3 times. They didn't just seat me with the vendors. They thought I was one. My phone buzzed again. A text from my mother. Catherine, I hear you have concerns about the seating. I stared at the screen. A second message appeared. Please don't make this difficult. Evelyn has many important guests to accommodate. Important guests. I typed a reply slowly. You seated me with the vendors. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then another message arrived. Adrienne, you're 31 years old. Act like it. I set the phone down on the bed. Outside the window, Manhattan traffic moved slowly through the evening light. For a moment, I considered packing my suitcase and leaving, catching the train back to Brooklyn, returning to the quiet comfort of my kitchen. But something stopped me. Maybe stubbornness, maybe curiosity, or maybe the simple fact that sometimes you need to see exactly how far people are willing to go. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The rehearsal dinner started in 2 hours. Table 28 would be waiting. What I didn't know yet was that someone else would be sitting there too. By the time I returned to the grand ballroom, the rehearsal dinner had already begun. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of round tables covered in champagne-colored linen. White orchids filled the centerpieces. their petals glowing softly in the warm light. A string quartet played quietly near the stage, the notes drifting through the room like background music in a movie. Everything about the evening whispered wealth. Servers moved gracefully between tables with trays of champagne. Guests laughed in clusters, greeting one another like old friends. 300 people dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns. And somewhere inside that elegant room, I was supposed to sit with the vendors. I found table 28 in the far corner near the kitchen doors, half hidden behind a tall column. The kind of placement that ensured no one important would ever accidentally look in that direction. 5 empty chairs surrounded the table. The vendors hadn't arrived yet, so I sat down alone. From where I was sitting, I could see the head tables clearly. At table 1, my mother stood beside Evelyn, greeting guests. Evelyn looked exactly like the magazines promised a bride-to-be should look. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect smile. Her dress for the rehearsal dinner was ivory silk, probably worth more than my monthly rent. People lined up to congratulate her. My mother stood beside her proudly, introducing her to guests like a prized achievement. Neither of them glanced toward table 28. Not once. 15 minutes passed. The ballroom filled with voices and laughter. Still, no one approached my table. Eventually, a waiter stopped beside me. "Ma'am, are you waiting for the rest of the vendor team?" Vendor team. The words landed strangely in the air between us. "This is my assigned table," I said calmly. He looked down at his seating chart, then back at me. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, but he simply nodded and walked away. Across the room, someone raised a glass for a toast. Applause followed. I sat quietly, watching my family celebrate from 30 feet away, invisible. After a while, I began to consider leaving, standing up, walking out, returning to Brooklyn where people knew my name and valued my work. But just as I pushed my chair back slightly, the ballroom doors opened. A man stepped inside. He was impossible to miss. Tall, mid-30s, dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His suit was Tom Ford, perfectly fitted in the effortless way that suggested he didn't need to think about appearances. They simply followed him. More than that, though, it was the way he carried himself. Calm, confident, like someone used to walking into important rooms. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the ballroom. For a moment, his eyes moved across the tables. Then they stopped. On me. Across the room. Something about the intensity of his gaze made my stomach tighten. Then he began walking. Not toward the head tables. Not toward the bar. Straight toward table 28. Guests glanced up as he passed, recognizing him. A few people whispered quietly to one another. But he didn't stop. Within seconds, he reached my table. "You're Adrienne Hayes," he said. Not a question. A statement. I looked up at him, surprised. "Yes." He pulled out the chair beside mine and sat down. "I'm Julian Cross," he said calmly. His voice carried a faint British accent. "I've been wanting to meet you." I blinked. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "Not personally." He folded his hands on the table. "But I know your work." That caught my attention. "My work?" "Yes." A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "I visited Luce de Mare 3 times. My heart skipped slightly. "You have?" "October 12th, he said easily. "I ordered the tagliatelle al ragu. You were standing at the pass tasting the sauce." He leaned back slightly. "You adjusted the salt, then the lemon, then tasted again before plating." I stared at him. "That was you?" "Yes, and November 3rd. And again 2 weeks ago." My mind raced. "You've been to my restaurant 3 times?" "All excellent visits," he replied. He glanced briefly around the ballroom, then back at me. "Though I must admit," he added thoughtfully, "I didn't expect to find you sitting at the vendor table tonight." I exhaled slowly. "Neither did I." He studied my face carefully. "Your family doesn't understand what they have," he said quietly. Before I could respond, the photographer approached our table carrying 2 cameras. The moment he saw Julian, his eyes widened. "Mr. Cross." Julian stood politely and shook his hand. "Good to see you again, Robert." Robert Chen, the wedding photographer, looked stunned. "I didn't know you were attending tonight." "I'm here with Adrienne." Julian rested a casual hand on the back of my chair. Robert blinked. "You're Adrienne Hayes?" "Yes." The photographer's expression shifted immediately. Recognition, respect, I've heard incredible things about your restaurant." Julian smiled faintly. "You should. Adrienne is one of the most talented chefs in New York." Across the ballroom, Evelyn turned her head suddenly. Her eyes landed on table 28, and for the first time that evening, my sister looked directly at me. Right at the moment, Julian leaned closer and said quietly, "Would you mind if we moved to a better table?" I frowned slightly. "Why?" He stood slowly and adjusted his jacket. "Because," he said calmly, "I think it's time people in this room understood exactly who you are." Sometimes the most interesting moments in a story happen when someone unexpected decides to change the direction of the room. If you're enjoying how this story is unfolding, stay with me, because what happened next is something no one in that ballroom ever forgot. For a moment, I just stared at Julian Cross. The ballroom around us buzzed with quiet conversation and clinking glasses, but suddenly everything felt strangely focused on our little corner near the kitchen doors. "You want to move tables?" I asked. Julian straightened his cuffs calmly, as if relocating during a formal dinner was the most natural thing in the world. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you shouldn't be sitting here." I almost laughed. "According to the seating chart, this is exactly where I belong." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you believe that?" Before I could answer, the florist, Sarah Martinez, arrived at the table carrying a glass of champagne. She stopped short when she saw Julian. "Mr. Cross?" Julian greeted her warmly. "Good evening, Sarah." Her eyes flicked toward me. "You two know each other?" Julian nodded. "I'm here with Adrienne tonight." Sarah blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh." Her expression changed quickly. Professional curiosity replacing confusion. "You're the chef from Brooklyn, right?" I nodded. "Luce de Mare. I've heard wonderful things," she said. Julian stood and gently pulled out my chair. "Come on." I hesitated. Across the ballroom, my mother was speaking with one of Christopher Whitmore's relatives. Evelyn stood beside them, smiling politely while guests congratulated her. They still hadn't looked toward table 28 again. "What if this causes a scene?" I asked quietly. Julian smiled faintly. "Then it will be a very interesting scene." He offered his hand. Something about his confidence made it difficult to refuse. After a brief pause, I stood. Julian guided me across the ballroom. The movement alone was enough to attract attention. Guests glanced up from their conversations as we passed. A few people recognized Julian immediately. Whispers followed us through the room. "Is that Julian Cross? What's he doing here?" I thought he was in Paris this week. At table 12, a young man in a navy suit stood up quickly. "Mr. Cross," he said, extending his hand. "James Whitmore, Christopher's cousin." Julian shook his hand easily. "Pleasure." James gestured toward the empty seats at their table. "Please join us." Julian turned toward me. "Adrienne?" Every eye at the table was suddenly on me. I recognized the look, the polite curiosity people use when they're trying to place someone. Who is she? Why is Julian Cross walking in with her? I sat down slowly. Julian took the chair beside me. "This is Adrienne Hayes," he said casually, "the bride's twin sister." The words landed like a dropped glass. James blinked. "Twin sister?" "Yes." Julian's tone remained relaxed. "And the owner of one of the most remarkable restaurants in New York." Now everyone at the table was fully interested. James's wife leaned forward. "A chef?" "Yes," Julian said. "Adrienne runs Luce de Mare in Brooklyn. 26 seats, handmade pasta, extraordinary attention to detail." My face warmed slightly. "You're exaggerating." "Not at all." He glanced around the table. "In fact, I'd recommend all of you make a reservation before it becomes impossible." James laughed. "Now I'm intrigued." Across the ballroom, something had finally caught my mother's attention. She turned toward our table. Her smile froze. Even from across the room, I could see the change in her expression. Confusion, then tension. Evelyn followed her gaze. The moment she saw me sitting beside Julian, her smile disappeared completely. She leaned toward my mother and whispered something urgently. At our table, the conversation continued. James asked questions about the restaurant. His wife wanted to know about the menu. Another guest asked if I specialized in Northern or Southern Italian cuisine. For the first time that evening, people were actually interested in talking to me. Not because of my last name, because of my work. Julian watched quietly beside me, occasionally adding a comment that steered the conversation back toward the restaurant. He wasn't dominating the room. He was redirecting it, subtly, carefully. Across the ballroom, my mother suddenly stood. Her chair scraped sharply against the floor. A few heads turned. She walked toward our table with the controlled determination of someone who had just realized something was going very wrong. Evelyn remained behind, watching. Julian noticed immediately. "She's coming over," he murmured. "I can see that." My mother reached our table and forced a tight smile. "Adrienne," she said. Her voice was pleasant, but the tension beneath it was obvious. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Julian stood politely. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, offering his hand. "My name is Julian Cross." My mother froze for a fraction of a second. Recognition flashed across her face. Of course she knew who he was. Anyone connected to high-end hospitality in New York knew that name. She shook his hand automatically. "Yes, of course." Her eyes flicked briefly toward me. "Adrienne, a word, please." Julian stepped aside. "I'll keep your seat warm," he said calmly. My mother guided me toward the hallway outside the ballroom. The moment the doors closed behind us, her smile vanished. "What are you doing?" she demanded in a harsh whisper. "I'm having dinner. At a table you were not assigned to. They invited me." "With Julian Cross," she snapped. "Yes." Her voice dropped lower. "Do you have any idea who that man is? I know him as someone who enjoys pasta." "This is not a joke." Her expression tightened. "Julian Cross consults for half the luxury hotels in Europe. The Whitmores have been trying to meet him for months." I blinked. "Really?" She leaned closer. "Do not embarrass your sister tonight. I'm sitting at a table eating dinner with a man whose opinion could influence Christopher's firm." So that was it. The problem wasn't that I had moved tables. The problem was who I moved tables with. I folded my arms calmly. "I didn't invite him," I said. "He invited himself." My mother stared at me, clearly trying to calculate how much control she still had over the situation. Finally, she said sharply, "This is Evelyn's weekend. Do not make it about you." I turned toward the ballroom doors. "I'm not the one who walked across the room," I said quietly. "You did." When I stepped back into the ballroom, every conversation at table 12 stopped. Julian looked up at me with a calm expression. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "For now." He studied my face for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. "Good. Because the evening is about to become very interesting." When I returned to table 12, the appetizers had just been served. Delicate plates of scallops rested on pale porcelain dishes, drizzled with citrus beurre blanc and tiny microgreens arranged like artwork. The kind of food designed to impress. Julian watched me take my seat again. "Everything resolved?" he asked quietly. "For the moment." He nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. Around the table, the conversation slowly resumed. James Whitmore asked about the restaurant again, curious now in a way that felt genuine. "So how did you start Luce de Mare?" he asked. I picked up my glass of water. "By accident, mostly." Julian chuckled. "That's not entirely accurate." I raised an eyebrow at him. "Oh? You started it with stubbornness and about 16-hour workdays." "That too." James's wife leaned forward. "Is it really only 26 seats?" "Yes." "That's tiny." "Intentionally," I said. "When the space is small, you can control every plate." Across the ballroom, the rehearsal dinner host stepped toward the microphone. The room gradually quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "if we could have your attention for a moment." Guests turned toward the stage. Christopher Whitmore's father stood and adjusted his jacket before walking to the microphone. He looked exactly the way people expect powerful men in their 70s to look. Silver hair, perfect posture, quiet authority. "Good evening," he began. "Thank you all for joining us tonight as we celebrate Christopher and Evelyn." Polite applause rippled through the room. I sat quietly listening. The speech followed the expected path. Christopher's achievements: Harvard Law, partnership at Harrington and Pike, the bright future awaiting the newly married couple. Then he turned toward Evelyn. "We are delighted to welcome Evelyn Hayes into the Whitmore family." More applause. At table 1, my mother smiled proudly. Christopher's father continued. "Evelyn is intelligent, accomplished, and most importantly, a perfect match for my son." The room laughed softly. He mentioned my mother by name twice, praised her for raising such an impressive daughter. I noticed something interesting. Not once did he mention that Evelyn had a twin sister. At our table, Julian leaned closer. You see the pattern? He murmured. I do. When the speech ended, the ballroom filled with applause again. Servers began clearing plates. The next course arrived. Fresh pasta. Handmade orecchiette with broccoli, rabe, and sausage. I took one bite. Immediately, my instincts activated. Too much lemon. Slightly undersalted. A professional chef can't stop analyzing food. It's a reflex. Julian noticed my expression. Problem? Just observing. Chef instincts. Yes. He smiled. Across the ballroom, Evelyn stood from her chair and walked toward the stage. She took the microphone next. Thank you all for coming tonight, she said. Her voice was confident, polished. The kind of speaking voice lawyers develop after years of presentations and courtroom arguments. She thanked Christopher, thanked his family, thanked her friends. She even thanked my mother again. But again, nothing about me, not even a passing reference. Julian glanced sideways at me. You don't seem surprised. I'm not. At that moment, Evelyn's eyes moved across the ballroom. For a brief second, they landed on me. Then they shifted away, like I wasn't there. She finished her speech to enthusiastic applause. When she returned to the head table, the room relaxed again. Guests resumed talking. Glasses clinked. The music started again softly in the background. Julian sat quietly for a moment, watching the room. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. I think I'll say a few words. I nearly choked on my water. You weren't invited to speak. That's never stopped anyone before. You'll cause a scene. Possibly. He stood. Julian, but it was too late. The room slowly quieted as people noticed him walking toward the microphone. Several guests recognized him immediately. Whispers spread through the ballroom. Christopher looked confused. My mother's expression tightened. Evelyn stared. Julian reached the microphone and adjusted it slightly. Forgive the interruption, he said calmly. His British accent carried easily across the room. For those who don't know me, my name is Julian Cross. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. I work with several international hospitality groups, he continued, and occasionally I have the privilege of discovering extraordinary culinary talent. My stomach dropped. He turned slightly, gesturing toward table 12. Tonight I had the unexpected pleasure of meeting someone whose work I've admired for quite some time. 300 people followed his gaze, directly to me. I felt every pair of eyes in the ballroom land on my chair. Julian smiled faintly. Adrienne Hayes. My mother went completely still. Owner of Luce de Mare in Brooklyn. Several guests murmured quietly. Julian continued. An extraordinary chef whose dedication to craft reminds us why food matters. My face burned. I wanted to disappear under the table, but he wasn't finished. In my opinion, Julian added calmly, she is one of the most talented chefs currently working in New York. Across the room, Evelyn's smile froze. My mother's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. Julian raised his champagne glass. To the Hayes sisters, he said. Both remarkable women. The room hesitated for half a second. Then applause erupted. 300 people turned toward my table, clapping, watching, noticing me for the first time all night. Julian returned to his seat beside me like nothing unusual had happened. I stared at him. You just made me the center of attention at my sister's rehearsal dinner. Yes. Why? He picked up his fork calmly. Because sometimes, he said, the room needs help noticing the person it overlooked. The rest of the rehearsal dinner passed in a strange blur. After Julian's toast, people began approaching our table. First one couple, then another. A man from Christopher's law firm asked about reservations at Luce de Mare. A woman introduced herself as a food writer and asked if she could visit the restaurant next week. Even James Whitmore's wife leaned over again. I had no idea Evelyn had a sister who was a chef, she said. I forced a polite smile. We've taken different paths. Across the ballroom, my mother sat perfectly still at table 1. Her expression had changed. Not embarrassment, calculation. Evelyn looked less composed. She kept glancing toward our table while whispering urgently to Christopher. Whatever story she had told her new family about me was clearly becoming more complicated. By the time dessert arrived, the evening had turned into something my family had never expected. People were asking about me, my work, my restaurant, and Julian Cross seemed perfectly comfortable allowing that attention to grow. At around 9:30 p.m., the rehearsal dinner finally ended. Guests slowly began leaving the ballroom. Julian walked with me toward the elevators. That was unnecessary, I told him. Was it? You put my family in an awkward position. He shrugged slightly. From what I observed tonight, they've been putting you in awkward positions for years. I didn't answer. At the elevator doors, he handed me a small card. Black. Minimal. His name printed in silver letters. Julian Cross. Call me sometime, he said. Why? I'd like to talk about your restaurant. And the real reason? I asked. He smiled faintly. I enjoy good food. Then he stepped back. Good night, Adrienne. The elevator doors closed. I leaned against the wall as the elevator rose toward the 8th floor. For the first time that evening, I felt tired. Emotionally tired. The rehearsal dinner had been uncomfortable, but it was over. Tomorrow would be the real wedding. And after that, I could go home. I fell asleep quickly that night. But the next morning started far earlier than I expected. At 4:17 a.m., shouting in the hallway woke me. I sat up in bed, confused. Voices echoed through the corridor outside my door. Panicked. Urgent. I stepped out of bed and opened the door slightly. The wedding planner, Vivian Hartley, was pacing the hallway with a phone pressed against her ear. Yes, I understand food poisoning, she was saying sharply, but I have 350 guests arriving tonight. She paused, listening. What do you mean the entire catering team is out? My attention sharpened immediately. Vivian ran a hand through her hair. I don't care how sick they are, we need someone here. Another pause. Then she exhaled slowly. Fine, she said. Call every agency in Manhattan. She hung up and immediately dialed another number. Marcus, it's Vivian. We have a catastrophe. I stepped fully into the hallway. Problem? I asked. She looked up, startled. For a moment, she didn't recognize me. Then realization crossed her face. Oh, Miss Hayes. Yes. She hesitated, then sighed. The catering team had a tasting yesterday. And? Food poisoning. My brain immediately switched into professional mode. How many staff? 32. All sick. And tonight's dinner? 8 courses, she said weakly, for 350 guests. That explained the panic. Without a catering team, the wedding reception would collapse. Replacing an entire kitchen staff in a few hours was nearly impossible. How long do you have? I asked. She checked her watch. 5 hours. I thought quickly. 8 courses. 350 plates per course. Nearly 3,000 dishes. Impossible for a random team to assemble perfectly, unless someone coordinated it. Vivian looked at me suddenly. You're a chef, right? Yes. Her eyes widened slightly. The restaurant Julian Cross mentioned last night? Yes. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then she asked the question she had probably been debating since the phone call. Could you help? I hesitated. The answer should have been obvious. This was my sister's wedding. The same sister who had placed me at table 28. The same family that had spent years pretending I didn't exist. Logically, this disaster wasn't my responsibility. But something deeper, something instinctive rose inside me. I was a chef, and chefs fix kitchen disasters. How many kitchen staff are still here? I asked. 23, she said. They know the menu, but they're lost without a head chef. I nodded once. Take me to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, I stood inside the Waldorf Astoria's massive industrial kitchen. 23 nervous staff members waited around stainless steel counters, unprepared, confused, panicking quietly. I tied my hair back and grabbed an apron. All right, I said loudly. Every head turned. We have 5 hours. Silence. Then I pointed to the prep station. 6 of you on pasta, 4 on the beef course, 3 on fish, the rest of you on vegetables and plating. The staff exchanged surprised glances. Move, I said. Something shifted immediately. Panic turned into motion. Knives started chopping. Pans heated. Orders flew across the kitchen. For the next 2 hours, I forgot everything else. The wedding, my family, even Julian Cross. There was only the kitchen, timing, temperature, precision, plate after plate after plate. When the final prep list was complete, Vivian approached slowly, her eyes wide. I think you just saved this wedding, she whispered. I removed the apron and washed my hands. No, I said quietly. I just made sure 350 people won't eat terrible food. Then I checked the clock. The ceremony started in 20 minutes, and no one in the ballroom had any idea what had just happened. By the time I slipped back into my room, the hotel hallway was buzzing with wedding guests. Voices drifted through the corridor. Laughter. The distant sound of music beginning downstairs. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment. My hands still smelled faintly of garlic and olive oil. 2 hours in the kitchen had passed so quickly that I barely remembered leaving. I washed my hands again, brushed my hair, and changed into the emerald green dress I had bought in Brooklyn. The silk felt cool against my skin. For a moment, I studied myself in the mirror. Same face as Evelyn, same eyes, same bone structure. But somehow tonight we looked like completely different people. One sister was about to walk down the aisle in a $12,000 Vera Wang gown. The other had just spent the afternoon coordinating a kitchen staff so the wedding dinner wouldn't collapse. I picked up my clutch and headed downstairs. The ceremony took place in one of the hotel's terrace halls overlooking Park Avenue. White orchids framed the aisle. Soft candlelight reflected off polished marble floors. A string quartet played Pachelbel's canon as guests took their seats. 350 people filled the room. Lawyers, investors, old family friends, people who lived in a world where appearances mattered more than almost anything else. I slipped quietly into a seat near the back, not the last row, but close enough that it was clear I wasn't part of the immediate family. When the music changed, everyone stood. Christopher Whitmore entered first, looking proud and slightly nervous. Then the doors opened again. Evelyn appeared on our father's arm. The room seemed to brighten when she walked in. Her dress was breathtaking. Ivory silk flowing behind her in a long train. The veil shimmered softly in the candlelight. For a brief moment as she passed my row, our eyes met. I smiled slightly. She looked away. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. Vows, rings, applause. Then the officiant announced them as Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Whitmore IV. Everyone stood. Music swelled. Cameras flashed. And just like that, it was time for the reception. The ballroom downstairs looked even more extravagant than the night before. Crystal chandeliers glowed above 28 round tables. Champagne towers sparkled beneath the lights. A live band played smooth jazz near the stage. And waiting quietly in the kitchen behind those elegant doors was the dinner I had just spent 2 hours preparing. No one knew. No one suspected. And I had no intention of telling them. I found my name card at the reception seating chart. Exactly where I expected. Table 28. Still the vendor table. Nothing had changed. I walked to the corner of the ballroom and sat down beside the photographer, the florist, and 2 event coordinators. They greeted me warmly. "Chef Hayes," the photographer said with a friendly grin. "Back with the vendor crew." I smiled politely. "Looks like it." The first course arrived 15 minutes later. Perfectly plated scallops with citrus beurre blanc. The same dish I had personally corrected earlier that afternoon. The photographer took a bite and nodded approvingly. "Wow, this is excellent," the florist agreed. "The catering team really stepped up tonight." I said nothing. Across the ballroom, I saw Evelyn laughing beside Christopher. My mother sat at the head table, perfectly composed, greeting guests. Everything looked flawless, exactly the way they wanted it. At 7:55 p.m., the ballroom doors opened again. I didn't need to look to know who had arrived. Julian Cross had that kind of presence. The room noticed him immediately. Whispers spread from table to table. He walked calmly through the ballroom, scanning the crowd. Then his eyes found me. He headed straight for table 28. "Adrienne," he said with a small smile. "Chef, you made it." He pulled out the chair beside me. "I wasn't sure if you'd come tonight." "Why wouldn't I?" He gestured subtly toward the room. Given how yesterday ended, I shrugged. "It's my sister's wedding." Julian studied the plate in front of him. He picked up his fork and tasted the scallops. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Then he looked at me. "You cooked this." It wasn't a question. "How can you tell?" I asked quietly. "The lemon balance," he said. "And the plating symmetry." He set the fork down. "You saved the catering team, didn't you?" I sighed. "They had food poisoning." "So you stepped in." "I coordinated the kitchen." Julian leaned back slightly, clearly impressed. "You just saved a 350-guest wedding reception." "I saved the food," I corrected. He shook his head slowly. "You continue to surprise me." The next course arrived. Handmade pasta. Exactly the way I had directed the staff to plate it. Julian tasted it and smiled. "Perfect." Around us, the ballroom filled with conversation and music. The guests had no idea what had happened behind the kitchen doors. But Julian seemed to be thinking about something, planning something. He checked his watch. "What time is it?" I asked. 8:45. "Why?" He looked toward the stage where the microphone stood waiting for speeches, then back at me. "Because," he said quietly, "I believe the evening is about to become memorable." My stomach tightened. "What are you planning?" He smiled faintly. "Nothing dishonest." "That's not comforting. Trust me," he said. Before I could ask another question, the wedding planner stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "it's time for the evening toasts." The best man spoke first, then Christopher's father. Polite applause followed each speech. The room relaxed. People expected the formal part of the evening to end. But then the planner spoke again. "We have one more guest who would like to say a few words." Julian stood, and the entire ballroom turned toward table 28. For a moment, the ballroom fell completely silent. 350 guests turned toward table 28 as Julian Cross stood up calmly and adjusted his jacket. The wedding planner stepped aside from the microphone, clearly unsure whether this was planned. Julian walked toward the stage with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in every room he entered. At the head table, Christopher looked confused. My mother's smile froze. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. Julian reached the microphone and gave the room a polite nod. "Good evening." His voice carried easily through the ballroom. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Julian Cross." A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Several guests whispered to one another. People in the luxury hospitality world knew that name. "I wasn't originally planning to speak tonight," Julian continued calmly. "After all, this evening belongs to Christopher and Evelyn." He paused briefly. "But sometimes a moment like this deserves a little honesty." The room grew quieter. Julian turned slightly, his gaze moving across the ballroom. Then it stopped, directly on me. "Tonight," he said, "I had the unexpected pleasure of sitting with someone whose work I've admired for quite some time." 300 people followed his gaze toward my table. My heart started pounding. "Adrienne Hayes." My mother's face went pale. Julian smiled faintly. "Owner of Luce de Mare, a small restaurant in Brooklyn." Murmurs spread through the crowd. "Over the past 6 months," he continued, "I've visited her restaurant 3 separate times." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Quietly, without introducing myself, a few people in the audience exchanged curious glances. Julian continued, "Some of you may know that part of my work involves consulting for several luxury hospitality groups." He paused. "And occasionally evaluating restaurants for international culinary guides." Now the murmurs were louder. People understood what he was implying. "Tonight," Julian said, raising his glass slightly, "I would like to share something that was officially announced only a few hours ago." My stomach dropped. Julian looked directly at me. "Luce de Mare has been awarded its first Michelin star." For half a second, the room didn't move. Then the ballroom exploded into applause. Guests stood, clapping, whispering excitedly. A Michelin star carried enormous weight in a room filled with wealthy New Yorkers. At table 1, my mother stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Christopher's father clapped politely. James Whitmore grinned broadly. Evelyn sat frozen. Julian wasn't finished. "And there's something else worth mentioning," he said. The applause quieted. "This afternoon, the catering team for this reception became unavailable." The wedding planner near the stage suddenly looked nervous. "But fortunately," Julian continued calmly, "someone stepped into the kitchen." He turned toward me again. "Adrienne Hayes personally coordinated the entire kitchen staff and ensured that every plate served tonight met the standard this wedding deserved." Gasps spread through the ballroom. 300 people turned toward the kitchen doors, then back toward me. Julian raised his glass. "So tonight," he said, "we celebrate Christopher and Evelyn." He paused. "But I also believe we should celebrate the extraordinary chef sitting quietly at table 28. The applause this time was louder, longer. Some guests even stood. I felt frozen in my chair. For years, I had been invisible in my own family, and suddenly 300 people were applauding my work. Julian returned to the table like nothing unusual had happened. He sat down beside me calmly. "You just announced my Michelin star at my sister's wedding," I whispered. "You earned it." You could have waited. Possibly. He glanced toward the head table. But I thought it might be useful for a few people in this room to understand exactly who they've been overlooking. Across the ballroom, my mother stood up slowly. Her expression was carefully composed again. She walked toward our table with the controlled grace of someone managing a situation she hadn't planned for. Guests parted as she approached. "Adrienne," she said with a tight smile. "Congratulations." Her voice sounded rehearsed. "How wonderful." I studied her face for a moment. "You didn't know?" I asked quietly. "Of course I'm proud," she replied quickly. I tilted my head slightly. "Are you?" For the first time in my life, my mother had no immediate response. Behind her, Evelyn remained seated at the head table, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Embarrassment, frustration, or maybe something else. After a moment, my mother nodded politely and returned to her table. The reception continued around us. Music resumed. Guests congratulated the newlyweds, but something in the room had shifted. People kept approaching our table. Investors, food critics, guests asking about reservations. Luce de Mare would be fully booked for months after tonight. Near midnight, the reception finally began to wind down. Julian walked with me toward the elevators. "You handled that remarkably well," he said. "I'm still processing what happened." "That's fair." When the elevator doors opened, he handed me another card. "My direct number," he said. "I'd like to talk about some opportunities for your restaurant." I took the card. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for seeing me." Julian smiled slightly. "You were always visible, Adrienne. Some people were simply looking in the wrong direction." The elevator doors closed. As the car rose toward the 8th floor, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because my family finally noticed me, but because I no longer needed them to. 6 months later, Luce de Mare had a waiting list 3 months long. The Michelin star changed everything. Food critics visited weekly. Investors called constantly. And for the first time in years, my phone rang with opportunities instead of expectations. My mother called too, several times. But I didn't answer, because the most important thing I learned that weekend wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom. They had seated me at table 28. The table meant for people who didn't matter. But sometimes being underestimated gives you the greatest advantage of all. It gives you time to build something real. And by the time people finally notice, you've already become someone they can't ignore.